Hey, it's Mystical Storms here. I wasn't planning on making another one tonight, but I can't sleep because, I don't know if you can hear, but in the background there's dripping and I have my dehumidifier on, so sorry if there's lots of background noise. But my room is so close of getting flooded because I am right over the kitchen and next to the room with all where the water goes. I have all the pipes going through my room. So right now I have to make sure my room doesn't get flooded with water and who knows what else. So let's just enjoy a fanfic together. It's a one-shot. It's called The Method, and it's by the Straw Hat Pirate on AO3. And as always, the fic's gonna be in the description, and please go kudo the author. And let's begin. Third person POV. Are you sure you want to do this, my boy? Toshinori Yagi wasn't the best teacher in the world. He knew he'd made for a decent symbol of peace and has done his best to uphold the people's spirits. He just couldn't help but feel he'd failed his charge. He defeated All for One, but at the price of his strength. He was now nothing more than a gangly shadow of the hero he was once. Emancipated and weak, Izuku was on the fast track to fill the gargantuan's shoes he left behind. While he didn't doubt the freckled boy could do it, it was a lot of pressure to put on a teenage boy. Izuku gave a smile. It was small and bordering on sad. There was something he wasn't saying. Toshinori didn't want to push. He knew this was a trying time for Izuku. It was trying time for most of Japan, but especially for the curly-haired boy. Now that All Might was retired and out of the picture, eyes were falling upon the next generation of heroes. With Izuku wielding One for All and taking on the challenge of becoming the number one hero, the entire world was watching and waiting for him to slip up. To show some signs of weakness, it was a terrible weight for a child to bear. I'm sure, Izuku said firmly, looking at Toshinori in the eyes and then Tsukashi. You see, while All for One had been defeated, he was far from dead. He was being kept in a high-security facility free from any other criminals. It was a place built just for him, filled to the brim with trained guards and pro heroes ready to strike when needed. Kept in a straitjacket at all times, locked in a windowless room with an automated machine gun pointed at him that would fire off and take his life at the slightest hint of movement. It was safe to say All for One wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. Why Izuku was so intent on visiting him, nobody knew. That's not to say they hadn't asked, of course. When he first approached Toshinori about it, timid, unsure, and very clearly nervous, it had been a hard no. All for One was the height of all evil. There was no way on God's earth Toshinori was letting his precious successor anywhere near such a monster. All for One had lived longer than any man should and had accumulated a vast amount of knowledge and refined his abilities to manipulate just about anyone who dared show the slightest bit of weakness in his presence. That should have been the end of it, but Izuku had come back just a day later with the same request. This time, he seemed more intent on it, more sure of himself. Toshinori had still given him the same answer, an uneasy yet firm no. That was full of questions that he received no answers to. He dwelled on why Izuku may want to visit a mass-murdering immortal without a moral compass or any values for human life. He'd come up dry. There was simply no plausible explanation. Why would Izuku want anything to do with that man, knowing that what he was and all he'd done? The third time Izuku asked, he reluctantly agreed to talk to Tsukashi. He was most trusted detective on the police force, and had never failed to rally with Toshinori and UA High. He was on their side and working closely in the All for One case. He was one of the few that could count on. They could count on. The man was earnest and someone Toshinori considered a close friend. Going to the man for advice was no-brainer. Toshinori felt out of his depth, torn between possibly alienating his successor by denying his request versus letting Izuku be exposed to one of the world's most vile evils. Tsukashi had admitted that a meeting between All for One and Izuku would be possible. Tsukashi and All Might had pretty much full control of what happened to the man and where he went. The Japan Hero Association had no idea what to do with the old cryptid. Toshinori was the one who knew his abilities and his history the best, so they hadn't hesitated to throw the issue at him. So long as All for One didn't kill anyone else, they were willing to let All Might do just about anything with the old fart, bearing, releasing him, and unruly things of that sort. Though they probably hadn't assumed All Might would ever consider taking an up-and-coming hero, a child, to see him. Izuku had asked a fourth time, and Toshinori had finally point blank asked why. Izuku responded was nothing short of evasion. He simply insisted that it was something he had to do without giving any reason as to why. Toshinori had wanted to say no again, but the look in the young boy's eyes. He was all but begging for trust, his eyes alight with hope and determination. He wasn't lying when he said that this was something he needed to do. You could tell that just by looking at him. Why it was something he needed to do was what had Toshinori stumped. So here they were at a building in the middle of nowhere that looked more like a block of cement than a regular structure. It was surrounded by tall walls and arched overhead, nearly forming a dome, but stopping just short of doing so. Cementos and several other pros had worked together to make this place as secure as possible. Now it crawled with trustworthy men and women who wouldn't hesitate to do what it was needed. Where All for One tried to stage a breakout, the man was too weak right now to do anything, but being overly cautious never hurt anyone who knew what he was capable of. We'll be in the next door over observing on a monitor. Midori, shout if you need anything. If you need something, we'll get you out of there pronto. So Tsukashi gave him a reassuring grin that made Izuku look a little less like he was marching off to his death. The boy looked like he was dreading this, and yet he was still doing it anyway. Toshinori didn't get it. There was something he didn't understand. Izuku had pushed for this, but he knew his successor. He looked absolutely terrified. He's right. We'll be right in here. Toshinori also smiled. Izuku nodded firmly back, face set into an expression that was grim yet sure. Tsukashi sipped at his coffee as he watched the curly-haired boy march out of the room and to the heavily guarded door to be let in. The ID card he was holding, as well as the fact that everyone had been told in advance that they'd be coming, allowed him instant access. Toshinori stilled himself, settling down in one of the rolling chairs tensely. Tsukashi looked at the one next to him, grimacing at the screen as the electric door opened. Toshinori didn't think All for One would try anything. He never would have let Izuku come within 10 miles of this place if he thought the man might. He was just uneasy. All for One was a stubborn man. He'd been grinning since he got here. For one thing, the coy smile hadn't faltered even once. Toshinori had gone in to talk to him along with Tsukashi and a few others, but it was to no avail. He said a total of 2 things since he got here. 2 things, and no more than that. Part of Toshinori was glad and hoping maybe that meant he wouldn't talk to Izuku. He knew was just wishful thinking. All for One knew exactly who Izuku Midoriya was. Toshinori didn't doubt the man had some form of sight that allowed him to identify people. Even with the copious amount of quirk restraints on his person, he immediately coined Toshinori when he came in, as well as Takashi. Thus had been the 2 times he spoke. He wouldn't miss a chance to mess with a young Midoriya. Toshinori anxiously tapped his foot, throat feeling uncharacteristically tight and heart thumping hard in his chest. It would be fine. Young Midoriya was strong, far stronger than Toshinori was at his age. All for One was just different sort of a beast. And that's all. Sitting next to him, Takashi could tell his blonde friend was nervous. His shoulders were stiff and hunched, and the tension hanging around him was so thick he could cut it with a knife. The detective couldn't blame him. You two had tried asking Izuku why he wanted to see all for One, and Izuku had responded with a very intent, "It's just something I need to do." And Takashi's quirk, human lie detector, had registered with a firm statement as the truth, which was perhaps the most jarring part of this all. Whatever this was, Izuku well and truly believed he had to go through with this. They watched Izuku hesitantly step into the room, and a pan of bulletproof glass was the only thing separating him from the world's greatest villain. The door shut and locked behind him with a loud bang and click that caused him to jolt forward. Toshinori could see his student's Adam apple bobbing precariously as he shuffled to the single chair bolted to the floor, frowning deeply and filling his thumb. He reluctantly sat down, and that's when it happened. All for One's grin absolutely dropped. For the first time since becoming imprisoned here, his expression melted into something else entirely. Takashi and Toshinori had both leaned closer to the monitor, expecting his new expression to be one of malice or hate, perhaps annoyance or some sort of twisted amusement, but no, it was opposite. It caused both men to pause, stare dumbly as All for One mangled face morphed into a full of disbelief and apparent horror, maybe even fear. The look was out of place on a man like him. His already pale skin got paler, and he tensed, leaning back as far as he could. Izuku simply stared at him with wobbling lips and teary eyes, hand clasped together so tightly his knuckles were white, so you could see the rod's approval on Izuku's face. No fear, no anger, but disappointment instead. Toshinori and Naomasa both shared a look, the detective bringing his drink to his lip, taking a long gulp. He was going to need something a little stronger depending on how this meeting went. "What are you doing here?" All for One breathed out. The third ever thing he'd ever said in this accursed place, so quietly the cameras almost didn't pick it up. The skin around his carved-over eye socket stretched, and it's like he had eyes still. Toshinori was sure they'd be wide as saucers. His voice sounded so distant, so shocked and disbelieving. It caused Toshinori's teeth to clench and his eyes to narrow. Takashi checked for the third time to make sure that this was all being recorded, bringing up his coffee for another swig. The smile Izuku gave was watery and nothing short of absolutely heartbreaking. "Hey, Dad," the freckled boy choked out. The reaction was instantaneous. Blood sprayed from Toshinori's mouth like water from a broken faucet, sunken eyes wide and jaw dropped. As the scarlet liquid began dripping down his jaw, Takashi had been mid-swallow as Izuku dropped the clismic statement resulting in his drink going down the wrong pipe. He began to choke, his eyes just as wide as his friend's as he wheezed and thumped his fist against his chest. Izuku. All for one trailed off, voice broken and sounded horrifyingly human. When I first heard your voice at Kamino, I thought I was hallucinating. Izuku's voice was quiet, but level. It was a voice I heard every Friday for years upon years. You never failed to call that, and I never failed to pick up. I guess I haven't seen you in so long, and it makes sense now, I guess. The nerves from before were gone. Izuku spoke with certainty that showed he thought long and hard about exactly what he wanted to say, and exactly how he wanted to say it. There was a steel resolve in the clench of his jaw and draw his brows. Izuku, all for one was cut off before he got a chance to continue. The taste of blood stayed strong in Toshinori's mouth. You weren't on a business trip in America. Izuku grit his teeth, his tears falling. These were not the type that he tended to burst out with, where he practically dehydrated himself with the force of his wailing. These were silent, far more tragic, dripping slow and salty down his face. All for one flinched as though he'd been struck. Toshinori, with his mouth, was still agape, realizing he'd never seen the man look so vulnerable. He wouldn't have thought it'd be possible if he weren't witnessing it at this very moment. Next to him, Tsukashi sucked in a few breaths, deep air still hacking so hard he was surprised a lung didn't come out. No, I wasn't. All for one whispered. Izuku bowed his head. You got hurt. By All Might. Izuku clenched his fists, and his voice waned with force of his emotions. And you knew I was his successor that night at Kamino. I would never hurt you, Izuku. All for one's voice was steadier now, but only slightly. I would never hurt you. It was a sour promise. Izuku seemed to think so too. It was the way his breath and shoulders hitch was anything to go off. But you have, Izuku protested wildly, eyes and flashing with a warning. Don't you get it? You left Mom and I was bullied my whole life, quirkless, beat down, and then you tried to take away the one person who came along and told me I could do it. You tried to take away a person who's been taking care of me over the past year. You tried to take away the person who's been taking more care of me over the past year than you ever had. All for one's face was riddled heavy with guilt, and the bits of anger, not at Izuku. No, he could never be mad at his son. Maybe the rage was for himself, or perhaps it was better aimed at those bullies Izuku spoke of. Maybe at Toshinori for swooping in and being Izuku's saving grace. That damned man didn't know when to quit, and All for One was almost glad for that, because his son was here, strong-willed and ready to fight, not afraid to confront him, and it was sure wasn't All for One who helped him grow to be that way. All for One had made a great many mistakes in his long life, but falling in love was now one of them. Some might argue that a man like him wasn't capable of such things, and he never would have begged to differ. Not until he ran into Inko Sakiaki, that is. She was witty and clever, with the biggest green doe eyes and the most beautiful urtan hair. She looked at him right in the eyes and seen right past the polite and unassuming facade he presented carefully to the world, and she smiled at him anyway. Inko was enrapturing. She was sweet, kind, and caring in ways he never would be. Everything heroes were meant to be, but weren't in his eyes. So he'd fallen in love, and he'd ask her to marry him, and that's what happened. Simple as that. For the first time in a long time, he was once again Hisashi Midoriya instead of All for One, a man capable of loving, caring, making jokes, ruining the kitchen, or breaking a vacuum cleaner, and ruining the kitchen, breaking a vacuum cleaner, and rolling his eyes to mundane TV shows. For a while, he was simply human. It was possibly the best, brightest times of his life, and he's not afraid to admit such. Izuku was born shortly after they were wed. He was the most perfect thing Hisashi had ever seen. He inherited Hisashi's wild curly hair. Finally, even now, he was blind. He could recall Izuku's freckles, so similar to those of his uncles. He was such a brilliant little boy, so smart and ready to help. He had the heart of a hero, and just as his uncle he held all those years ago. Izuku was something to be cherished. He was something to be loved. He was someone that All for One had wanted to give the world. But it was all ripped away when All Might and him fought. Perhaps anger had driven him to this point. He'd been sour, wanting desperately for his son and wife, but knowing he'd only scared them with his deformed face, growing bitterness. Hisashi once again became All for One, burying himself in his work, and it was the easiest thing in the world to slip back into the role. He was going to kill All Might if it was the last thing he did. He decided. He created Nomu's and got a hold of Nana Shimura's grandson and begun to groom him. He put together a league that would be the symbol of peace's end. He was All for One, the greatest villain in the world. Except on Fridays, between the hours of 5 to 8 p.m. During that time, he was Hisashi Midoriya again. His phone calls with his son and wife were a great escape. He pretended he was just fine, not at all injured or damaged or evil down to his bones. He'd talk about the weather in America and tell them how much he missed them and he wished they were here. He'd cheer Izuku on because if his son wanted to become a hero, then Hisashi was sure he'd be the best one to ever walk the planet. While him inheriting Toshinori's power was a cruel twist of fate, there was no better person to wield the power once belonging to his younger brother. If anyone deserved it, it was Izuku. How it had all gone so wrong, he wasn't sure. He just knew it was his fault. He'd always tried to be a good father, but men like All for One weren't made for it. He wasn't built to care for others. Something in him was broken, and try as he might, he knew hurting those he dared to love was horrific inevitability. I'm sorry, Izuku. All for One murmured. Izuku bit the inside of his cheek. Anger pierced its way through him, intermingling with his sorrows starkly. All for One was a horrible person. He taught someone Izuku had grown to loathe during his time as All Might's apprentice. Tales of all the vile things he's done and all the suffering he'd caused were sparse but always gruesome. When All Might did dare to murmur them, they painted a horrifying picture of the ruthless man incapable of love. It was easy to hate All for One when he wasn't a person, when he was just a story, just a faceless figure that Izuku had never seen, had never met. It was easier to hate someone you didn't know, and All for One was the worst of the worst. He had hurt thousands, would continue hurting them, and Izuku had taught him the most monstrous being in the world for all he'd done. The moment Izuku heard his voice, that image fell in place and crumbled on the ground. It didn't take long to connect the dots, and it was devastated once he did. He'd been so lost and conflicted in the aftermath. All for One and Hisashi Midoriya were the same person. It just barely managed to click in his mind when it did. Izuku had been left clueless as to what to do. How could someone who cheered him on as a hero, told him how much he loved him, and teased him mercilessly about things he had little to no significance in a grand scheme of things, playfully for the fun of it, also be the world's greatest villain? He could still recall his father's warm eyes aligned with the fondness as he told Izuku a bedtime story, the way he'd feel so tall when his dad put him on the shoulder, the man reassurance over the phone that even without a quirk he could be an amazing hero, that he'd be proud of him no matter what. He'd been near tears when Izuku announced that he was in UA, and a mixture of worried and angry when he found out that USJ had been attacked. There was no way that was all a lie, right? It couldn't be. Was his father nothing more than a fake construct meant to mess with him? Was Izuku a puppet? You took away my hero, Izuku grit out, wiping furiously at his eyes. His father's face hardened. All Might is still alive. You're carrying on his will. I believe. As much as it pains me, All for One side, but I always love you and cheer you on, Izuku. You're my son, and nothing will ever change that. Izuku felt sick. He felt relieved. He felt angry and upset, and he felt yearning. He felt devastation, and a pervading coldness that he had been crawling up his spine ever since he finally learned who his father was. He felt too many things at once to possibly name. Not him, Izuku whispered. Not All Might. He's my favorite hero, but he wasn't my hero. Dad, you were. Toshinori froze. Sakashi held his breath, trying to get over his shock. All for One seemed to dissolve at those words. What was left of his face twisting with a horror as Izuku stood up and lurched forward in his restraints, earning a warning beep in response. As his son gathered himself, Izuku gathered the scrapes of a composure with shaking hands and tear-stained cheeks. Everything All for One was as a villain melted away at those two simple words. One's All Might and Sakashi never would have guessed would affect him so drastically. But he looked horrified, guilty, like he couldn't believe what he'd done. There was regret. It didn't make up for anything. All for One felt his chest ache, and suddenly he realized just what this was, because he wasn't All for One right now. He'd never been in Izuku's eyes. Right now, he was Hisashi Midoriya, and he'd hurt his son. I really like this fic, personally. I like the way how, they're all shook it, from, you get what I mean. And I like how how the author made it that, he was two different people, but the same person at the same time. On the Friday from 5 to 8, he wasn't All for One, And it just hurt so badly to find out that, how All for One hurt Izuku so much. After he's like, oh yeah, you are my hero. Bitch. Yeah. So, All for One, we hate All for One, but at the same time, if he wasn't a villain in the fanfic way, not the general actual canon story, he would have been a good father. But he's a villain, so it kind of, he's not just a villain, he's the worst villain out there, so it kind of puts the scale way off. So yeah. Sorry, I'm tired. It's 2 a.m. right now, and I just can't sleep, so I'm just rambling now. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this. I've been posting a lot in the last 24 hours, literally. So If you're new here, please like and subscribe and check out my other content. I try to post as often as possible. I had taken a break because I was in Serbia when I started recording, and once I came back, shit went haywires. But it's life. C'est la vie, as we say. Anyway, I'm gonna probably go try sleep now. Well, I'm gonna edit this first and try to sleep. And then hopefully I will get my money from the insurance tomorrow and apply for my college programs. Woohoo! Anyway, I love you. Make sure to hydrate. And have a wonderful day. Bye.